About 2 weeks ago, my friends and I decided to explore an old industrial area on the edge of town. It's a cluster of abandoned warehouses that's been empty for decades. Rumors always surrounded the place, stories about people going missing or strange things happening to those who stayed too long. We didn't believe any of it and figured it would just be a fun night of urban exploration. There were 3 of us: me, my friend Mark, and his cousin Danny. We brought flashlights and planned to take some photos inside the largest warehouse, a crumbling structure with broken windows and rusted doors. The first hour was uneventful. We wandered through empty rooms filled with debris and graffiti. The place smelled of mildew and rust, and every sound echoed eerily, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Then, we found a set of stairs leading to the basement. The air was colder down there, and the space felt much smaller. The walls were lined with old lockers, and the floor was littered with scraps of metal and broken glass. As we moved deeper into the basement, we noticed a strange noise, like faint tapping, coming from somewhere ahead. Danny joked that it was just rats, but none of us laughed. The sound was too rhythmic and too deliberate. Mark insisted we check it out, so we followed the noise to a heavy metal door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and the tapping stopped as soon as we got close. Mark pushed the door open, revealing a small room. In the center was an old table, and on it a single flashlight sat upright, turned on. But the beam wasn't steady. It flickered erratically, as if someone had just dropped it there moments before. We didn't stay to find out who. The 3 of us bolted out of the basement, back up the stairs, and out of the warehouse. We didn't stop running until we were back at Mark's car. On the way home, none of us said much, but I could tell we were all shaken. A few days later, Mark called me. He said Danny hadn't been answering his phone since the night at the warehouse. At first, I thought he was overreacting. But when I tried calling Danny myself and got no response, I started to worry too. Mark suggested we go back to the warehouse to see if Danny had returned there. I didn't want to, but I couldn't say no. When we arrived, the place was even more unsettling than before. The air felt heavier, and the silence was oppressive. We went straight to the basement, retracing our steps to the metal door at the end of the hall. This time, it was wide open. Inside, the flashlight was still there, but now it was lying on its side, turned off. On the table, someone had scratched a word into the surface. "Stay." Mark called out for Danny, his voice echoing through the basement, but there was no response. Then we heard it, the tapping sound again, coming from somewhere deeper in the darkness. It was louder this time, more insistent, and it seemed to be moving closer. We didn't wait to see what it was. We ran back up the stairs, but halfway up, Mark tripped and fell. As I turned to help him, I saw a figure at the bottom of the stairs. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was tall, and it wasn't moving like a normal person. I pulled Mark to his feet, and we sprinted out of the building. When we reached the car, we didn't look back. We never found Danny. The police investigated, but didn't find anything except an old jacket they said might have been his. Mark and I haven't talked about that night since. Whatever was in that warehouse wasn't just a story. It was real, and I don't think it wanted us to leave. About a month ago, I got a call from my friend Nate. He's the kind of guy who's always looking for some thrill, and this time he wanted to check out an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. The place had been shut down for years, and there were rumors about it being haunted, or worse, used by squatters or something sketchy. I wasn't sure about going, but Nate convinced me by saying he'd heard a story about a secret underground level that no one had explored. He was certain we'd find something cool, maybe old equipment or even money left behind. We went late at night, thinking it would be easier to avoid anyone who might care that we were trespassing. The building was massive, with broken windows and rusted metal siding. Inside, it was just as you'd expect. Empty halls, collapsed ceilings, and graffiti everywhere. At first, it was just us goofing around, taking pictures and making jokes to keep the tension low. But then we found a hatch in one of the back rooms. It looked out of place, newer than everything else around it. Nate was immediately excited, saying it must be the entrance to the underground level. The hatch wasn't locked, so we opened it and climbed down. What we found wasn't anything special. Just another room, but it was eerily clean compared to the rest of the factory. The walls were bare, and there was a single table in the middle with a notebook on it. Nate grabbed the notebook and flipped through it. Most of the pages were blank, but a few had weird scribbled notes. Phrases like, "It's watching," and "Don't stay after dark." We both laughed nervously, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still using the space. Then we heard it. A faint, metallic sound, like something being dragged across the floor, coming from the far corner of the room. We froze, listening, but it stopped. Nate whispered that it was probably just an animal, but I wasn't so sure. We decided to leave, climbing back up the hatch and sealing it behind us. Neither of us talked much on the way home. A week later, Nate called me again. He said he couldn't stop thinking about the factory and wanted to go back. I told him it was a bad idea, but he brushed me off, saying he'd be fine. That was the last time I talked to him. When Nate didn't show up for work the next day, his family got worried and called me. I told them what I knew, but it wasn't much, just that he'd planned to go back to the factory. I offered to check it out with his brother Jake, since the police wouldn't act on a missing persons report so soon. When we got to the factory, everything seemed the same, but the atmosphere was heavier. We found the hatch again, and it was slightly open. Jake and I climbed down, calling Nate's name, but there was no response. The room was the same as before, except the notebook was gone. Then we heard the metallic dragging sound again, louder this time. It echoed from a hallway we hadn't noticed before. Jake wanted to follow it, but I insisted we leave. He didn't listen, so I reluctantly went with him. The hallway led to another room, larger and darker than the first. In the middle was the notebook, open to a single page. Written in bold, messy letters was the phrase, "He's still here." Before we could react, the metallic sound started again, closer now. Jake grabbed the notebook, and we bolted for the hatch. As we climbed out, the dragging sound followed, but we didn't stop to look back. We called the police that night, but when they searched the factory, they didn't find anything. No hatch, no notebook, and no sign of Nate. I don't know what's under that factory or who or what is using it, but I do know that Nate isn't coming back. Something in that place didn't want us there, and I'm certain it got what it wanted. A few months ago, I took a new job as a night security guard. It wasn't the most glamorous gig, but the pay was decent and the hours fit my schedule. The site I was assigned to was an abandoned industrial complex on the edge of town. It was massive. Rows of empty warehouses, rusted machinery, and long-forgotten offices. The property was being prepped for redevelopment, and my job was to ensure no one broke in to vandalize or steal materials. At first, it was uneventful. I'd do my rounds with a flashlight, checking each building, occasionally scaring off a stray cat or raccoon. Most of the warehouses were empty, save for piles of scrap or broken furniture. The only building I didn't have access to was an old assembly plant at the far end of the property. The door was padlocked, and I was told by my supervisor not to bother with it. It was unsafe and slated for demolition. One night I was in the middle of my rounds when I heard something. It was faint, like the echo of a voice coming from the direction of the assembly plant. I told myself it was probably the wind or some animal, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, almost like a low hum or a chant. I radioed my supervisor to report it, but he brushed it off, saying the place was full of strange acoustics that could make normal sounds seem eerie. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next few nights, things got weirder. I'd find doors open that I was sure I'd locked. My flashlight would flicker even though I'd just replaced the batteries. And always, the faint hums seemed to come from that locked assembly plant. One night, I decided to get a closer look. I walked up to the plant and peered through a broken window. Inside, the floor was littered with debris, and the air felt heavier than it should have. Then, I saw something move. A shadow crossing the far wall. It wasn't my own, and there was no one else around. I backed away quickly, telling myself I'd imagined it. But as I turned to leave, I heard a faint click behind me. The padlock on the door was swinging open, even though no one had touched it. The next day I debated quitting. The job was starting to mess with my head, and I wasn't sure it was worth it. But I convinced myself to stick it out. After all, I couldn't afford to lose the paycheck. That night I avoided the assembly plant entirely, sticking to the other buildings. But halfway through my shift, the hums started again. It was louder this time, and it seemed to follow me, no matter where I went. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to the assembly plant. The door was still ajar, the padlock lying on the ground. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The interior was just as grim as I'd expected, but the hum was deafening now, vibrating through the walls. I followed the sound to a set of stairs leading down to a basement I hadn't known existed. The air grew colder as I descended, and the hum turned into something worse. Whispers. The basement was pitch black, but my flashlight revealed what looked like an old break room. In the center was a circle of chairs, and on each chair was an old, tattered coat. The walls were covered in scratches, as if someone or something had tried desperately to claw its way out. Then, the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating. I turned to leave, but as I reached the stairs, the door at the top slammed shut. My flashlight flickered, and in the brief moments of light, I saw shadows moving around the room. Too many to count, and none of them mine. I ran, slamming into the door with all my strength until it burst open. I didn't stop running until I reached the security office. Grabbing my keys, I left the complex and never went back. I quit the next day, and when I tried to explain what happened to my supervisor, he just gave me a strange look. He told me I wasn't the first guard to leave suddenly, but he wouldn't elaborate. A few weeks later, I read that the redevelopment project had been canceled. Apparently, during an inspection, workers discovered something in the basement of the assembly plant. The article didn't go into detail, but it mentioned human remains. To this day, I can still hear the hum in my nightmares. Whatever was in that plant wasn't just an echo or some strange acoustics. It was something far worse, and I'm grateful I got out when I did.